From marshland to market town, King's Lynn has always had strong links with the Wash. One of the first recorded incidents occurred in 1216, when the baggage train containing King John's treasure was lost. Local historian Dr. Paul Richards explains.
He had been in Lynn, he was fighting at the time later on, and he was in Lynn in October 1216. And he wanted to go north again, and there's various stories about where he stayed in Lynn. I don't know how much we believe of all that, but then of course the River Ouse wasn't there. The River Ouse ran through Wisbech, but certainly had a baggage train, and certainly that baggage train took a shortcut as he was heading north. For a long baggage train, quite heavy, to go all the way round via Wisbech may have been safer, but taken an awful long time. So probably the baggage train went across the causeway, but King John went via Wisbech because he spent the night in Wisbech Castle. So he didn't go across the causeway, he went via Wisbech, and of course he ended up eventually at Newark. But he went to Wisbech. We don't know how much stuff he took with him. I wouldn't have thought he'd have let his most precious jewels and possessions go with the baggage train. I'd have thought he'd have wanted to keep a lot of stuff with him, but no one knows, you see. Miscalculations were made. Probably they were in a hurry, you see, and they probably took no notice of the guide saying it's a bit dangerous to go now, and they said, oh, let's go, and all this. Anyway, tide caught the train, and writers at the time talk about King John losing his treasure and lots of other things. His chapel was lost. We don't know how many men were lost. I should imagine lots of animals, you know, bullocks or oxen and horses who were pulling the carts. The writers who talk about it are all writing, you know, 20, 30 years later. So whether he lost his treasure in the Wash, he certainly lost things in the Wash, we don't know how much. But he went on next day and he eventually ended up at Newark, where he died.
Maurice Whiting is a King's Lynn fisherman who began working on the fishing boats at the tender age of 11.
My fishing boat was the Windulsa. I bought that up Old Boy Kirby in Pilot Street, and I paid £20 for it. I don't think you get a boat for that now. That had a hole in the bottom, and it had a petrol lorry engine that didn't work, and a net with not so many holes in as what it was when I finished, because there were all great big holes in it.
We were in a secure world. Our parents was there. We done what our parents told us to do. When they said come in, we came in. There was no back answering. The people what lived in my world when I was young were workers. There was no handouts in those days, none at all. Only thing is, what people used to have, they used to have a second dividing club, which they paid threepence each for the children and sixpence each for the adults each week. And that covered them for glasses, teeth, and to see the doctor. But if the father of the family was ill and couldn't go to work, then they handed a small sum of money over to the family like that.
Fishing is not the only industry to have graced King's Lynn's dockyard. The import-export business has also played a significant part in its history. Voyages to Iceland, the Baltic, Italy and Spain, the New World and the Low Countries of Belgium and Holland are just some of the trade routes from the area.
Lots of wine was coming into King's Lynn, and fish from the Baltic Sea, and timber from Russia and what's now Poland was coming into King's Lynn, cloth from the Flanders, and from King's Lynn went lots and lots of wool, and then cloth, and then ale and salt, because salt was made around the Wash through getting salt out of sand, washing salt out of sand, and then boiling it off for the crystals. So a big trade many hundreds of years ago. The docks themselves, which are not far from where we're sitting, they only date from the 19th century. The docks were built much later. King's Lynn only had docks in the late 19th century, but has been a port for nearly 1,000 years.
The largest ports on the east coast of England, 17th century, were Great Yarmouth, Hull and King's Lynn. King's Lynn was the largest exporter of barley and malt during the period of 1620-21, but by 1734 it had become the lowest exporter.
The merchants had their warehouses by the waterside, so the ships could come in, they could unload the timber, the wine quite easily. They built cellars under the warehouses, and then the warehouses contained lots of corn, mainly wheat, which could be loaded onto the ships. Before that, lots of wool. So the key to the merchants' life was to make their life easier, and so they could make lots of lovely money. They needed to be close to the waterside. If you weren't close to the water, it meant you had to carry very heavy things over land, and that cost money and time. So the merchants had to move their complexes all the time to make sure they were close to the waterside.
Smuggling was, and still is, rife in the Wash. Contraband, such as precious metals, alcohol and tobacco, were brought into the area, as Morris Whitting explains.
We have had boats come across. I did, even the Russian boats years ago, they wouldn't let you go near the boat much, but sometimes they'd call you over if you'd got any fish. And I didn't have a lot one day. I chucked them half a bucket of shrimps up, and I had about 4 or 5 little fish, that's all. So they took it up, and that was I got a good price for them. They sent me 2 bottles of vodka down and a carton of cigarettes, so that was a good tickle, that was.
There were always smugglers in the Wash. Lots of French ships in 1716, the Royal Navy had to come to the Wash to chase them away. So they're quite exciting records, you know. And they had their special ship. It was called the Revenue Cutter, and it went after smugglers. And there was a battle once at Hunstanton, and 1 or 2 people are buried at Hunstanton from one battle between smugglers and, you know, and the Marines. Because
Anne Hornigold was born in the North End area of King's Lynn. This was home to the fishermen, as she explains.
In North End, as I said, there was fishermen, and the fishermen lived in North Sea, but the main fishermen lived down North End's yard. There was Buntons, they lived down there, Bustle Smith, or Neely, a fisherman. The Smiths, there was 3 Smith brothers and Mr. Massingham. They all died, they drowned on the marsh. The storm came up and the boat sank, and they all. But if my father-in-law would have been on the marsh in their houseboat at the time, he could have saved a lot of them, because they just didn't know where they were. That was Mr. Miller. He worked on the docks as a tidying on the ships. But the thing of the matter is, fishermen worked hard. As my mother used to say, the day you see a poor fisherman and a poor farmer, you know the country's in a poor way. And that's how it is today.
I've always had a boat. I can't swim. I don't like the water, that's wet and cold, so I try and keep it out, but I fell in quite often. I nearly drowned about 10 or 12 years ago now, I think, on a quayside in the middle of the night. But that ain't nothing to worry about, because you just go numb and just go unconscious. I was virtually unconscious when they dragged me out, so you don't struggle, let's put it that way, so don't worry about it.
The fishermen were hard working. But when we get after the 1926, when they had the national strike, when all the people wanted was a decent living. I mean, when I went to work, I worked 48 hours a week for 8 and 3pence, which in today would be 45 pence. I know people said things were cheaper, but that didn't make it any easier.
I've built several different sorts of boats, so I know a little bit about building. So nobody had been drowned. I've never lost anybody at sea, but I've picked several up. I've brought on more sometimes than what I started out with. But the other thing is, if you do start to sink, you know what the best pump in the world is, do you?
No.
You don't know. I'll tell you what it is. That's a frightened man with a bucket. Because he don't stop, and it don't break down, and it don't get clogged. But When you see if there's anything wrong, it's one hand for you and one for the boot. And when it gets too bad, that's two hands for you and bugger the boot.
The unit, North End, has declined. The North End is no more. The council destroyed it. If they'd have kept it there and cleaned the house up, put them, that would be a tourist tour what would draw thousands of people to see it.
Oh, Truchard was simply, there are two sides of a coin here, because Truchard was simply in the middle of the fishing community. So where we're sitting now, this was part of commercial premises, a shop, and behind you, in the 1901 census, the rooms behind you were called the North End Eating House. So it was a cafe. So the yard just behind us, Truchard, has got two 18th century cottages. So Truchard, the smithies next door, we can see it out of the window here, that was where the carts were mended for the whole of the North End. And in the yard we also have a fishing smack, used to do cockling and so on, of 1904. Truchard was saved by a group of North Enders led by Pat Midgley. Pat wasn't a North Ender, or isn't a North Ender, she's still alive and okay. But it was saved by a group of people in the 1980s. Although we saved the two cottages, four had been demolished in the 1930s. Mr. True owned it, you see, and he was the last, or one of the owners, so the yards were named after owners, hence Truchard. A heritage centre stroke museum was developed for North End people to remember the past, but also everyone else, the heritage of this area. And we have a Friends of Truchard. We have education courses. You can do family history. I teach part-time for UEA continuing education upstairs on regional and local history. So we do education, we welcome tourists, we're a community centre. We have over 6,000 photographs, which we're now trying to, we've got a digitisation project. So that's an important one for us. And we're hoping maybe to expand into other cottages next door, the last two cottages next door, but that's a big question mark at the moment. But we have been going, we opened in 1991, officially opened by the Prince of Wales in 1993. The second stage, 1995, next door was an old public house. That was opened by Sir John Paul Getty in 1998. So Truchard has continued to develop as a focal point and is well known, not just in Lynn, but throughout the region and beyond, as a good example of what a community museum can do, but we rely greatly on volunteers. So without the good volunteers, we would not be here, we couldn't run the place.
If you liked this video, please remember to